England, spring. 1805. Devonshire House. The chandeliers of Devonshire House blazed like captured stars, each crystal prism scattering rainbow fragments across the polished parquet, where London's elite waltzed in careful circles. The air hummed with conversation and laughter, punctuated by the lilting strains of a string quartet tucked into the gallery above. Silk gowns in every jewel tone swept past like exotic birds. Emerald greens, sapphire blues, ruby reds, their wearers adorned with family diamonds that caught and reflected the candlelight. Lady Diana Ashworth stood at the periphery of this glittering assembly, her gloved fingers trembling slightly against the ivory handle of her painted fan. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty that painters struggle to capture. Auburn hair that caught the firelight like burnished copper, arranged in an elaborate coiffure threaded with seed pearls. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the Thames, held a quality that spoke of quiet strength rather than practiced coquetry. Her gown of pale rose silk, though elegant, was last season's fashion, expertly altered, a detail the sharp-eyed matrons would certainly notice. "Stand straight, Diana," her mother whispered urgently, her fingers adjusting a loose pearl in her daughter's hair with movements that bordered on frantic. "The Duke of Meadowhall is looking this way. Remember, your three brothers need commissions. Edward is 20 and still without prospects. James and William fare no better. Your father's debts." She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Your father's debts won't disappear on their own." Diana's breath caught in her throat as she followed her mother's pointed gaze across the crowded ballroom. There, framed by the arched doorway like a portrait study in aristocratic severity, stood the man who had become the subject of every whispered conversation that season. Edson Thorne, 5th Duke of Meadowhall, was a figure seemingly carved from shadow and restraint. At 34, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that caused conversations to halt mid-sentence and heads to turn in unconscious deference. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a military man, despite having never served, he wore his evening attire with such precision it might have been a uniform. His dark hair, nearly black in the candlelight, was swept back from a face of sharp planes and angles, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a mouth set in a line that suggested smiles were foreign to it. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled. Ice blue and penetrating, they swept the ballroom with the calculation of a general surveying a battlefield, cataloging assets and weaknesses with equal dispassion. Unlike the other gentlemen who clustered in animated groups, gesticulating as they debated politics or boasted of hunting exploits, the Duke remained perfectly still. He held a crystal flute of champagne in one gloved hand, but Diana noticed he never once raised it to his lips. He was an island of stillness in a sea of movement, and somehow that made him all the more noticeable. His reputation had preceded him like the chill before a storm. Wealthy beyond comprehension, his estate stretched across 3 counties, and his investments in shipping and railways had multiplied his fortune exponentially. Politically powerful, he held significant sway in the House of Lords and was known to have the ear of several cabinet ministers, and perhaps most remarkably, emotionally impenetrable. At 34, he had remained stubbornly unwed, despite a decade of concerted campaigns by ambitious mothers hoping to secure his title and fortune for their daughters. Those ice-blue eyes locked onto Diana with sudden, disconcerting focus. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the sound so loud in her own ears, she was certain the entire ballroom must hear it. She fought the urge to look away, to hide behind her fan like the other young ladies who wilted under male attention. Instead, she straightened her spine and met his gaze with what she hoped resembled composure rather than the terror currently churning in her stomach. He moved toward her with mechanical precision, the crowd parting before him like water before the prow of a ship. Each step was deliberate, measured, efficient. No wasted motion, no hint of uncertainty. Lady Diana. His voice, when he finally stood before her, was cool as November rain and just as uncompromising. Not cold, precisely, but utterly devoid of warmth. He acknowledged her mother with the briefest of nods, before returning his full attention to Diana, his gaze sweeping over her with the detached assessment one might give horseflesh at auction. Your father and I have reached an understanding. Not a greeting, not even a proper introduction. Simply a statement of fact delivered with the emotional inflection of a solicitor reading a contract. Diana's romantic heart, the part of her that had devoured Gothic novels by candlelight and secretly dreamed of love matches like her parents once shared, shattered in that moment. But even as something tender died within her, her spine straightened further. She had known this day might come. Her father's gambling debts had mounted over the past 3 years. Disastrous investments in a South American mining venture, losses at the card tables of whites, loans called in by increasingly impatient creditors. Her brothers needed military commissions that cost far more than the family could afford. Her younger sisters required dowries. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She executed a perfect curtsy, years of deportment lessons evident in the graceful dip. "I am honored by your attention. Walk with me." Again, not a request, but a command, though he did offer his arm with perfunctory courtesy. Diana placed her gloved hand lightly on his sleeve, acutely aware of the hard muscle beneath the fine wool of his evening coat. They moved through the ballroom, and she felt the weight of countless eyes upon them, curious, envious, pitying. Whispers followed in their wake like the rustle of autumn leaves. "I shall speak plainly, Lady Diana," Edson said, as they reached the relative privacy of the conservatory entrance, where potted palms provided a screen from the most obvious onlookers. "I require a wife of suitable lineage and impeccable reputation. Your father has indicated your willingness to consider such an arrangement." "I see." The words tasted like ash on her tongue. "And what, precisely, does such an arrangement entail?" "I need a Duchess capable of managing the social requirements I find tedious, hosting dinners, attending functions, maintaining correspondence with appropriate families. I need competent household management of my estates. Eventually, I shall require an heir, though there is no urgency in that particular matter." He delivered this catalog of requirements with the same tone he might use to order a new carriage. "In return, you shall want for nothing material. Your family's debts will be settled immediately. Your brothers will receive their commissions. Your sisters will have generous dowries. You yourself will have complete autonomy in how you spend your time and your considerable allowance, so long as you fulfill your duchessly obligations without creating scandal." Diana's throat tightened. And companionship, Your Grace? Affection? Might those develop with time? For the first time, something flickered across his austere features. Surprise, perhaps, or possibly amusement, though it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. The mask of indifference returned immediately, more impenetrable than before. I make no promises beyond what I've stated. I am offering you security, status, and independence. Many women would consider that generous. He paused, studying her face with those unsettling blue eyes. If these terms are agreeable, we shall announce our engagement at the Pemberton Ball next week. If they are not, I bid you good evening and shall pursue other candidates. Other candidates, as though she were one of several horses he was considering purchasing. Might I have time to consider? Diana asked, though she already knew her answer. What choice did she truly have? Her father had gambled away their future. Her family depended on her. You have until tomorrow evening. Send word to my secretary at Meadowhall House. He escorted her back to her mother without another word, bowed with precise correctness, and disappeared into the crowd with the same purposeful efficiency that had marked his approach. That night, Diana lay awake in her narrow bed in the family's rented townhouse in an unfashionable corner of Mayfair. Through the thin walls, she could hear her father's snoring and, more distressingly, her mother's muffled weeping. The moonlight streaming through her window illuminated the cracks in the plaster ceiling, the faded curtains, the worn carpet, all evidence of their declining circumstances. She thought of the Duke's cold blue eyes, his emotionless voice, the transactional nature of his proposal. She thought of her brother's futures, her sister's prospects, her parents' desperation. And she wondered, as the bells of St. James's Church struck 3, whether she had just agreed to sell herself into a beautiful prison, one gilded with Meadowhall gold, but locked nonetheless. The tears came then, silent and bitter, soaking into her pillow as the city slept around her. Chapter 2. The Wedding and Abandonment. 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like planning a funeral than a wedding. Diana had sent her acceptance the morning after the ball, a simple note penned in her neatest hand. Your Grace, I accept your terms. Lady Diana Ashworth. No flowery sentiment, no false protestations of joy, just agreement to a contract. The wedding took place on a gray morning in late April, 1805, in the medieval chapel on the Meadowhall estate. The ancient stone building, dating back to the 13th century, rose from the Yorkshire countryside like a monument to permanence and duty. Fitting, Diana thought bitterly, for a marriage founded on precisely those principles. She stood in the vestibule, her hands trembling so violently that her bouquet of white roses shook visibly. The gown her mother had somehow managed to procure was exquisite. Belgian lace over ivory silk, with seed pearls sewn into intricate patterns across the bodice and sleeves. The family pearls, one of the few heirlooms not yet sold to creditors, circled her throat. She looked every inch the perfect bride. She felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. The chapel doors opened, and she processed down the ancient aisle alone, her father having departed immediately after giving his consent, too ashamed to face what his failures had wrought. The pews held exactly 50 guests, each one carefully selected by Edson's secretary for their social or political value. Diana recognized few of them. This was not her wedding. It was a ducal announcement. Edson waited at the altar in immaculate formal attire, his dark coat and breeches cut with military precision. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression as unreadable as always. When Diana reached his side, he did not smile, did not offer any gesture of reassurance or warmth. He simply nodded, as one might acknowledge a business associate arriving for an appointment. The elderly vicar, clearly uncomfortable with the glacial atmosphere, rushed through the ceremony with unseemly haste. Diana heard herself speaking vows that felt like surrender, promising to love, honor, and obey a man who had explicitly told her not to expect affection. Her voice wavered only once, on the word cherish. When it came time for the ring, Edson produced a band of Castilian gold, set with diamonds that caught the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. He slid it onto her finger without once meeting her eyes, his touch impersonal and brief, as though he were signing a document rather than binding himself to another human being for life. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar intoned with evident relief. Edson did not kiss her. He simply offered his arm and escorted her back down the aisle as the organ wheezed out a triumphant march that felt grotesquely inappropriate. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in Meadow Hall's Great Hall, a cavernous room with hammer-beam ceilings and walls lined with portraits of stern-faced Thorn ancestors. Long tables had been arranged in precise rows, each place setting positioned with geometric exactitude. The 50 guests ate course after course, served with military efficiency. Consommé, turbot and butter sauce, saddle of mutton, asparagus and cream, trifle, and finally a towering wedding cake that Diana could barely look at, let alone taste. Throughout the interminable meal, Edson conversed with the gentlemen seated near him about parliamentary matters, the ongoing war with France, concerns about agricultural reforms, debates over trade policy. He spoke with animation she'd never heard him use with her, his voice carrying authority and occasional flashes of dry wit that drew appreciative chuckles from his peers. Diana sat beside him in her wedding finery, decorative and utterly dismissed. When Lady Pemberton attempted to engage her in conversation about the estate, Edson answered for her, as though she were a child, incapable of speech. When Lord Hartley asked about her family, Edson smoothly redirected the conversation to less uncomfortable topics. She was the Duchess. She was also invisible. By the time the last guests departed in the late afternoon, Diana's face ached from maintaining a serene smile. Her new husband escorted her to the grand staircase, where Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, waited with a knowing expression that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and disapproving. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your chambers," Edson said. "I have correspondence to attend to. I shall join you later." The phrasing made Diana's stomach clench with anxiety. The ducal bedchamber was a monument to masculine authority. The enormous four-poster bed, draped in heavy brocade curtains of deep burgundy, dominated the space. Ancestral portraits lined the walls. Generations of Thorn dukes and duchesses staring down with expressions ranging from severity to outright hostility. A massive fireplace crackled with a fire that did nothing to warm the room's oppressive atmosphere. Diana's trunks had already been unpacked by efficient maids she'd not yet met. Her modest belongings looked pathetic in the vast wardrobes and dressing rooms. A nightgown of delicate lawn, trimmed with lace, had been laid out across the bed. Her mother's gift, intended for this night. She dismissed the maid who'd helped her undress and stood before the mirror in the nightgown, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like a virgin sacrifice from a Gothic novel. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a mixture of nervousness, dread, and something she refused to name as hope. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps in private, away from society's eyes, Edson might show some warmth. Perhaps this marriage might become something more than a transaction. The clock on the mantel struck 10, then 11, then midnight. Finally, near 1 o'clock in the morning, the door opened. Edson entered still fully dressed in his wedding attire, though he'd removed his cravat. He paused at the threshold, his ice-blue eyes taking in the scene. Diana by the fire, the turned-down bed, the intimate atmosphere the servants had carefully prepared. His expression hardened. "This marriage serves a purpose," he announced without preamble, making no move to approach her. His voice was as cold and businesslike as it had been in the Devonshire House conservatory. "I need an heir eventually, but not yet. There is no urgency. I need a Duchess to manage the social requirements I find tedious. You will fulfill that role admirably, I'm certain. In exchange, you have security, status, and the autonomy I promised. Do not expect more than what was agreed upon." Diana's breath stopped in her lungs. "Your Grace, the adjoining chamber has been prepared as your private quarters," he continued, gesturing to a door she hadn't noticed. "You will find it adequately appointed. Monthly allowances have been arranged through my secretary. If you require anything for the household or estate, submit requests through Mrs. Hartwell." He turned toward another door on the opposite side of the room. His own private chamber, she realized with dawning horror. "Edson!" The name escaped before she could stop it, stripped of title, raw with confusion and hurt. He paused but did not turn around. "Good night, Your Grace." The door closed with a decisive click that echoed through the vast chamber like a judge's gavel. Diana stood frozen, still wearing the nightgown meant for a wedding night that would never happen. The portraits seemed to mock her with their knowing stares. Slowly, as though moving through water, she walked to the bed and sat on its edge, her hands folded in her lap. The tears came silently, tracking down her cheeks and dripping onto the delicate lawn fabric. She wept for the girl she'd been, who dreamed of love. She wept for the loneliness that stretched before her like an endless winter. She wept because she'd sold herself into exactly what she'd feared. A beautiful prison, locked not with bars, but with indifference. Diana woke as gray dawn light crept through the heavy curtains. For one disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed down. The wedding, the dismissal, the lonely night in a bed meant for two. She rose and moved through the silent chambers, noting that Edson's door remained firmly closed. Perhaps he was still sleeping. Perhaps she should knock, try to speak with him more reasonably in daylight. But when she descended to the breakfast room, Mrs. Hartwell was waiting with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. "His Grace departed for London at dawn, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, handing Diana a sealed note. "He left this for you." Diana's hand shook as she broke the seal. The message was brief, written in a bold, slashing hand. Your Grace, Her Grace may redecorate the ducal apartments and estate as she sees fit. Monthly allowances have been arranged through my secretary, Mr. Pemberton, who will call upon you Thursday next. Mrs. Hartwell has full knowledge of household management and will assist in your transition. Meadowhall, not even Edson, just his title, as cold and impersonal as a business memorandum. He had left. On the morning after their wedding, he had simply left. The first week at Meadowhall passed in a fog of unreality. Diana wandered the vast estate like a ghost, unable to quite believe the enormity of what her life had become. The manor itself was magnificent, a Jacobean masterpiece of honey-colored stone, with mullioned windows and elaborate chimneys. Gardens stretched in every direction, precisely manicured, yet somehow lifeless. Beyond them, tenant farms dotted the rolling countryside, their cottages visible in the distance like scattered dice. The household staff numbered 40, all of whom watched her with cautious curiosity. They were polite, but distant, unclear what to make of this young duchess their master had married and promptly abandoned. Diana felt their eyes following her wherever she went, felt their whispered speculations when she passed. Letters arrived with clockwork regularity, delivered by a footman each Monday morning. But they were never from Edson, always from his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, writing in that same precise hand. His Grace will be occupied with parliamentary duties through August. Then, 2 weeks later, His Grace has business matters requiring his attention in Yorkshire. Then, most devastatingly, His Grace extends his stay in Scotland indefinitely. He trusts Her Grace finds Meadowhall to her satisfaction. Each letter felt like another door closing, another confirmation of what Diana had tried to deny. Edson had married her to check a box on his list of ducal obligations. Secure appropriate wife. Ensure succession line. And then promptly forgotten her existence. She was the Duchess of Meadowhall, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in England. She was also utterly, completely alone. On the 7th evening of her solitary residence, Diana stood in the morning room, staring at her reflection in the Venetian mirror that dominated one wall. The woman looking back at her wore an expensive day dress of primrose silk. Family pearls circled her throat. Her hair had been dressed by a skilled lady's maid in the latest fashion. She looked like a duchess. She felt like nothing. But as she stood there, something shifted inside her. A hardening, a crystallization of resolve. If Edson would not see her as a wife, would not grant her even the basic dignity of his presence, then she would forge her own purpose. If he won't see me as a wife, Diana whispered to her reflection, her voice gaining strength with each word, then London will see me as a duchess. Chapter 3. The Transformation. The next morning, Diana summoned Mrs. Hartwell to the morning room with a newfound sense of purpose burning in her chest. If she was to be the Duchess of Meadowhall in truth, rather than merely in name, she needed to understand exactly what that meant. Mrs. Hartwell, I should like to see the estate account books, please. The housekeeper's eyebrows rose fractionally, the most expression Diana had yet seen on her carefully neutral face. The account books, Your Grace? Yes, all of them. The household accounts, the tenant records, the agricultural reports, everything pertaining to the management of this estate. Those matters are typically handled by Mr. Pemberton, the steward, Your Grace. I'm not certain. Then please ask Mr. Pemberton to call on me this afternoon. Diana kept her voice pleasant but firm, and have the household accounts sent to the library immediately. When Mr. Pemberton arrived, he was a man of perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone who'd managed the Meadowhall estates for decades, and saw no reason why a 22-year-old Duchess should suddenly take an interest. His skepticism radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Your Grace, he bowed with perfunctory courtesy, his arms laden with leather-bound ledgers. Mrs. Hartwell indicated you wish to review the accounts. I assure you, everything is in perfect order. His Grace has never found cause for complaint. His Grace, Diana replied coolly, has not been in residence for more than a fortnight in the past 3 years, according to these records. Please, sit. Let us begin with the tenant farms. What Diana discovered over the next 3 days of intensive study made her blood alternately boil and freeze. Meadowhall was not poor. Far from it. The estate generated enormous income from its agricultural holdings, timber rights, and mining interests. Edson's personal fortune was staggering, augmented by savvy investments in shipping and the new railways. But the wealth flowed in only one direction, away from the land and the people who worked it. Tenant cottages hadn't been repaired in a decade. Roofs leaked. Wells had gone dry. Fields were poorly drained, reducing crop yields year after year. The village school had closed 5 years ago for lack of funding. There was no doctor within 10 miles. It wasn't poverty. It was indifference. Edson had extracted every possible shilling from his lands while investing nothing back into them. He cared nothing for the people who bore his name and depended on his stewardship. This will change, Diana announced to a startled Mr. Pemberton on the 3rd morning. All of it. Your Grace, I hardly think— I am not asking your permission, Mr. Pemberton. I am informing you of my intentions. Now, please arrange for me to inspect the tenant farms. I shall need a horse and a guide. The reality proved even worse than the ledgers suggested. Diana rode out across the estate, her riding habit already dusty from the June heat, and witnessed the human cost of her husband's neglect. At the Miller cottage, rain poured through gaps in the thatched roof into buckets set strategically around the single room where a family of 7 lived. Mrs. Miller, heavily pregnant with her 8th child, apologized profusely for the mess, as though the leaking roof were somehow her fault. At the Blackwood farm, 3 children with hollow cheeks and 2 thin arms watched Diana with enormous eyes. Their father explained that the wheat yields had been poor for 3 consecutive years due to inadequate drainage. At the village square, the former schoolhouse stood empty and crumbling, its windows broken, its door hanging from rusted hinges. Diana returned to Meadowhall that evening with dirt on her hem and fury in her heart. Mrs. Hartwell, she said, striding into the housekeeper's office with unladylike directness. I need the names of reputable builders, thatchers, well diggers, and anyone else who might undertake significant repair work. I also need to speak with the local physician. Does one exist? Dr. Thornbury practices in the next village, Your Grace, but— Excellent. Send him an invitation to call on me tomorrow. And Mrs. Hartwell? Diana paused at the door. I know you've served this household for many years. I know you likely think me an impulsive girl playing at being Duchess, but I assure you, I am quite serious. Things are going to change at Meadowhall." For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered across the housekeeper's face. "Yes, Your Grace." The transformation began with the small things. Diana authorized repairs to the 3 most desperately dilapidated cottages. She arranged for new wells to be dug where the old ones had run dry. She visited each tenant family personally, learning names, listening to concerns, making notes in a leather journal she carried everywhere. The tenants were initially suspicious. Gentry rarely visited, except to collect rents or evict failures. But Diana returned, week after week, and gradually, suspicion gave way to cautious hope. Next came the larger projects. Diana negotiated with local builders to renovate the village schoolhouse, then hired a young woman from York to serve as teacher. She established a farming cooperative that allowed tenants to share expensive equipment: plows, seed drills, threshing machines, dramatically reducing individual costs while improving efficiency. The manor's crumbling east wing, long, closed and forgotten, became her most ambitious project. Diana transformed it into a convalescent home for soldiers wounded in the ongoing war with France. She furnished it with beds, hired nurses, and worked with Dr. Thornberry to provide medical care that these men could never have afforded. Word spread quickly through the countryside. Throughout it all, Diana made a point of learning every servant's name, from the most senior footman to the youngest scullery maid. She inquired after their families, remembered birthdays, genuinely cared about their lives beyond their service. Mrs. Hartwell, initially resistant, gradually became Diana's staunchest ally. The housekeeper began offering suggestions rather than objections, her respect earned through Diana's genuine dedication and tireless work. By autumn of 1805, Meadowhall had transformed. The changes were visible from the main road: new thatch gleaming golden on cottage roofs, children in clean clothes playing outside the reopened school, fields properly drained and planted with next year's crops. Lady Pemberton, whose estate bordered Meadowhall to the south, arrived unannounced one October afternoon, ostensibly to pay a courtesy call, but clearly dying of curiosity. "My dear Duchess," she said, accepting tea in the newly refurbished drawing room, "the entire county is talking about you. The Duke's young bride has wrought miracles, they say. Have you truly opened a hospital for wounded soldiers in your own home?" "A modest convalescent facility," Diana corrected gently. "These men gave everything for England. The least we can do is help them recover in comfort." "And the school? The farming cooperative? The repairs?" Lady Pemberton shook her head in wonder. The Duke must be extraordinarily proud. Something twisted in Diana's chest, but she kept her smile serene. "His Grace is occupied with important matters in London." The invitations began arriving shortly after, the local gentry, eager to meet this remarkable young Duchess. Diana hosted small gatherings, modest affairs compared to London standards, but warm and genuine. She was careful, always conscious of Edson's warning about creating scandal. But she allowed herself this much. The letters from Mr. Pemberton continued their weekly arrival. In late November, one finally acknowledged her work. His Grace extends his compliments on your Grace's excellent management of the estate. He notes the improved revenues with satisfaction." Diana read it twice, searching for any personal word from Edson himself. There was none, just satisfaction at improved revenues, as though she were an efficient steward rather than his wife. But as she set the letter aside, Diana realized something had shifted. She was managing Edson's estate better than he ever had. She had earned the respect of the tenants, the servants, the neighboring gentry. She had created something meaningful from the ruins of her romantic dreams. Her confidence, crushed on, her wedding night, had been rebuilt, not through her husband's regard, but through her own capability. When the cream-colored envelope arrived in early December, embossed with the royal seal, Diana knew what it was before she opened it. An invitation to the London season, beginning in January of 1806. She stood at the library window, watching snow begin to fall across the Meadowhall gardens she'd restored to life, and made her decision. "It's time," she said softly to her reflection in the darkening glass, "to show society what a Duchess can be." Chapter 4. London's Perfect Duchess. The January cold bit through even the finest wool as Diana's carriage rattled through London's cobbled streets. Inside, wrapped in Russian sable, she watched the familiar cityscape emerge from the winter gloom. So different from the woman who had fled to Meadowhall 8 months prior. Her trunks, following in a second carriage, contained a wardrobe befitting her new station. Sapphire silks that complemented her coloring, emerald velvets trimmed with ermine, morning dresses in the latest French fashion, despite the ongoing war. She had spared no expense. If she was to be the Duchess of Meadowhall in London society, she would look the part. The Meadowhall townhouse on Grosvenor Square stood 4 stories of imposing Georgian elegance. Footmen emerged immediately to assist her, and the butler, Henderson, she recalled from her brief wedding visit, bowed with considerably more warmth than he'd shown 8 months earlier. "Your Grace, welcome. We received Mr. Pemberton's letter. Your apartments have been prepared." "Thank you, Henderson." Diana stepped into the marble-floored entrance hall, her trained eye noting the fine proportions, the elegant staircase, the wealth displayed with restraint. "Is His Grace in residence?" The butler's expression remained perfectly neutral. "His Grace remains at his club, Your Grace. He has not been in residence at the townhouse this season." Of course not. Diana felt the familiar twist of disappointment and pushed it aside. She had not come to London for Edson. She had come to claim her place in society. "Very well. Please inform His Grace's secretary that I have arrived. Should His Grace wish to call." She swept up the staircase, her bearing betraying none of the hollowness in her chest. Lady Pemberton's ball, scheduled for the following Friday, would serve as Diana's debut. She dressed with care, a gown of midnight blue silk that made her skin luminous, sapphires at her throat that Edson had sent as a wedding gift, but never presented in person. Her lady's maid arranged her dark hair in an elegant coronet, threaded with silver ribbons. "You look magnificent, Your Grace," the girl breathed. Diana studied her reflection. She did look magnificent. Poised, elegant, every inch a duchess. Only she knew that her heart hammered against her stays, that her palms were damp inside her long gloves. She would walk into that, ballroom without her husband. Alone. The whispers would be merciless. The carriage ride to the Pemberton residence passed in a blur. Too soon, she was standing at the top of the grand staircase as the butler's voice rang out. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Meadowhall." Every head turned. Conversation faltered, then resumed in hushed whispers that followed her descent like a wake. Poor thing, married to that cold fish. They say he hasn't visited Meadowhall since the wedding. Dreadfully awkward, appearing without him. Diana kept her head high, her smile serene, and channeled every ounce of dignity she had cultivated over 8 months of rebuilding herself. Lady Pemberton rushed forward to greet her with genuine warmth. "My dear Duchess, how wonderful you look. Come, you must meet everyone." What Diana had not anticipated was how her months at Meadowhall had changed her. The girl who had married Edson would have wilted under the scrutiny, desperate for approval. But the woman who had transformed an estate, who had negotiated with builders and farmers, who had earned the respect of an entire countryside. She was different. She remembered names effortlessly. She asked thoughtful questions about people's interests, their families, their concerns. When Lady Ashworth mentioned her son serving in Spain, Diana spoke knowledgeably about Wellington's campaign, expressing genuine concern for the young man's welfare. When Lord Hartwick complained about agricultural reform, she engaged him in serious discussion about crop rotation and field drainage. She was warm without being frivolous, intelligent without being threatening, dignified without being cold. By the end of the evening, half of London was captivated. Diana's Thursday afternoon gatherings began almost by accident. She had invited a few acquaintances for tea, intending the typical society affair of gossip and cards. But when the conversation turned to literature, she found herself mentioning a novel she'd recently read, and suddenly everyone was engaged in genuine intellectual discourse. The following week, she was more deliberate. She invited not just aristocrats, but also Maria Edgeworth, whose novels Diana admired, along with several reform-minded politicians and their wives. The conversation ranged from women's education to Catholic emancipation to the latest developments in agricultural science. Word spread quickly through London's drawing rooms. By March, Diana's Thursday gatherings had become the most sought-after invitation of the season. Sir Humphrey Davy demonstrated his safety lamp for minors, explaining the science with infectious enthusiasm. Maria Edgeworth read from her manuscript in progress. A young poet named Lord Byron recited verses that made the ladies blush and the gentlemen thoughtful. When the Duke of Wellington himself appeared one Thursday in early April, fresh from the peninsula, the room fell silent with awe. Diana greeted him with perfect composure. "Your Grace, what an honor. I've followed your campaigns with great interest." Wellington's weathered face creased in genuine surprise. "Have you indeed, Duchess? Most ladies prefer not to trouble themselves with military matters." "I find logistics fascinating, Your Grace. Your supply chain management at Talavera was particularly brilliant, maintaining 7 days' provisions while moving an army of 20,000. The Duke stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. "Good God, she knows her stuff. Meadowhall, you lucky dog. Where did you find this one?" Diana smiled serenely, though something ached at the mention of her absent husband. I've had access to extensive military correspondence, Your Grace. One learns a great deal from reading." What she didn't mention was that those long hours reading Edson's military papers in his Meadowhall study had been her attempt to understand the man who was her husband. She had learned strategy and logistics and war, but of Edson himself, she had learned nothing new. The newspapers began calling her London's perfect Duchess after she organized a charity auction that raised £3,000 for war widows and orphans. Caricaturists drew her as Athena, goddess of wisdom, surrounded by books and scientific instruments. She spoke 4 languages fluently: English, French, Italian, and passable German. She championed unpopular causes with such grace that even opponents found themselves reconsidering their positions. She advocated for prison reform, better working conditions in factories, expanded education for the poor. Marriage-minded mamas began to despair. Every young lady was compared to the Duchess of Meadowhall and found wanting. If only you had Diana's poise, Charlotte. The Duchess speaks 3 languages, Eleanor. Surely you can master French. Did you hear how brilliantly she handled Lord Castlereagh's opposition to her school proposal? Through it all, Edson remained conspicuously absent. He attended Parliament, she knew, his club, various functions, but never her Thursday gatherings, never the balls and soirees where she shone so brightly. Society noticed. The whispers changed tenor. He's a fool to neglect such perfection. What is wrong with Meadowhall, leaving her to manage alone? If I had a wife like that, I'd never leave her side. Diana maintained dignified silence about her marriage. When asked about Edson, she smiled and murmured something about his important parliamentary work. She never complained, never explained, never betrayed the loneliness that deepened with each passing week. Privately, she wrote letters to Meadowhall about the estate's progress. She reviewed Pemberton's weekly reports. She maintained her connection to the place that had saved her, even as she conquered London society. But late at night, in her elegant bedchamber in the Grosvenor Square townhouse, she sometimes allowed herself to wonder, what was the point of being perfect if the one person whose regard she craved never witnessed it? It was at Lady Hartwick's musicale in late April when Lady Catherine Pembroke leaned close during the intermission, her fan fluttering with practiced nonchalance. "My dear," she whispered, her eyes glittering with malicious curiosity, "have you heard the rumors about your husband and Lady Margaret Sinclair?" Chapter 5. The Mistress Rumors. Diana's hand tightened imperceptibly on her fan, but her expression remained perfectly serene. "I'm afraid I don't indulge in gossip, Lady Catherine." "Oh, but this is hardly gossip, my dear." Lady Catherine leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They've been seen together, frequently, at the theater, Vauxhall Gardens." She paused for effect. "Entering his townhouse at inappropriate hours." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Diana forced herself to breathe, to maintain the composure that had become her armor. How unfortunate that people have nothing better to occupy their time than watching others' comings and goings. "My dear Duchess, I only thought you should know. Lady Margaret Sinclair is, well, she has a certain reputation. Beautiful, of course, those emerald eyes, but a widow with scandalous tendencies. And your husband has been seen on her arm repeatedly these past weeks." The music resumed, saving Diana from having to respond. She sat through the second half of the musicale hearing nothing, seeing nothing, her mind churning with images she could not banish. Edson with another woman. Edson smiling at another woman, the way he had never smiled at her. Edson wanting another woman, when he had shown such complete indifference to his own wife. She had thought herself resigned to his coldness. She had rebuilt herself without him, created a life of meaning and purpose that did not depend on his regard. But this was different. This was not absence. This was replacement. Diana told herself she would not investigate. She told herself it was beneath her dignity, that what Edson did was his own affair, that their marriage was one of convenience and nothing more. She lasted 2 days. On the 3rd day, she called her lady's maid, Sarah, who had proven both discreet and resourceful during their months at Meadowhall. "Sarah, I need you to make some inquiries. Quietly. I need to know about Lady Margaret Sinclair, where she goes, who she sees, whether there's any truth to certain rumors." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." Diana also did something she had never imagined herself capable of. She hired a street urchin, a clever boy of perhaps 12, and paid him to watch Edson's club and report on his movements. The reports that trickled back over the next week confirmed everything Lady Catherine had whispered. Lady Margaret Sinclair, a widow of 28, with emerald eyes and a scandalous reputation, seen repeatedly with the Duke of Meadowhall at various social engagements, observed, entering his townhouse, not the one Diana occupied on Grosvenor Square, but his private apartments near St. James's, at 10 o'clock in the evening, departing at midnight, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Each detail was a knife between Diana's ribs. The pain was exquisite and entirely unexpected. She had thought herself armored against Edson's indifference. She had not realized how much she had still hoped, deep in some foolish corner of her heart, that he might one day see her worth. Now he saw someone else's worth instead. The public humiliation came at the opera the following Tuesday. Diana had accepted Lady Catherine's invitation to join her party in the Pembroke box, needing the distraction of company and music. She had dressed carefully, a gown of ice blue silk that made her look ethereal and untouchable, and held her head high as she entered the theater. She noticed the whispers immediately, the heads turning, the fans fluttering with barely concealed excitement. Something was happening, something everyone knew about except her. Then she saw. Across the theater, in the Meadowhall private box that should have been hers, sat Lady Margaret Sinclair. She was stunning, raven-haired, with those famous emerald eyes, her crimson gown cut scandalously low. And beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, sat Edson. Diana's breath caught. She had not seen her husband since their wedding night 8 months prior. He looked older, harder somehow, his handsome face set in severe lines. But as he leaned toward Lady Margaret, murmuring something that made her laugh, his expression softened in a way Diana had never witnessed. Their eyes met across the theater. For one endless moment, Diana stared at her husband, and he stared back. His expression revealed nothing. No guilt, no regret, no acknowledgement of any impropriety. Just that same cold assessment she remembered from their wedding night. Lady Margaret followed his gaze, and when her eyes found Diana, her lips curved in a smile of pure triumph. Diana felt something crack inside her chest. But years of training held. She inclined her head in the barest acknowledgement, then turned away as though the sight were of no consequence whatsoever. She took her seat, opened her fan with practiced grace, and appeared to study her program with mild interest. Around her, she could feel the gossips watching, cataloging every detail of this delicious scandal. The perfect Duchess, confronted with her husband's mistress. What would she do? What she did was nothing. She sat through the entire opera with perfect composure, applauded at the appropriate moments, and smiled serenely at her companions. Only Lady Catherine, watching her with shrewd eyes, seemed to perceive the devastation beneath the flawless facade. Diana returned to the Grosvenor Square townhouse in a fog of numbness that felt safer than the pain lurking beneath it. She dismissed her servants, wanting only solitude, and stood at the window, her bedchamber watching rain streak the glass. She could leave, simply pack her things and return to Meadowhall, retreat to the life she had built there. But even as she thought it, she knew it was impossible. Her family's financial security depended entirely on this marriage. Her father's debts had been paid with Edson's money. Her younger sister's dowries existed only because of her sacrifice. She was trapped. Trapped in a marriage to a man who wanted nothing from her except the appearance of respectability. Trapped by golden chains that bound as surely as iron. The rain fell harder, and Diana pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She had made herself perfect, intelligent, accomplished, beautiful, dignified. She had transformed his estate, won London's admiration, become everything a duchess should be. And it still wasn't enough. Would never be enough. "Will I ever be enough?" she whispered to her reflection in the darkening glass. The knock at her chamber door came as a surprise. "Your Grace," Henderson's voice called softly. "Lord Hartley requests an urgent private audience. He says it's a matter of great importance." Lord Hartley. Diana knew him slightly. An officer in the Foreign Office, perhaps 40, with shrewd gray eyes and a reputation for discretion. Her father had known his family. He was trustworthy, or as trustworthy as anyone in London society could be. "Show him to the library," Diana said, straightening her shoulders. "I'll be down directly." She found Lord Hartley pacing before the fire, his face grave. He bowed when she entered. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion at this hour, but I have information that you need to hear, and it cannot wait." "Regarding my husband's affair?" Diana kept her voice steady. "I assure you, Lord Hartley, I am already aware." "Your Grace," he interrupted her gently but firmly. "Lady Margaret Sinclair is not your husband's mistress." Diana stared at him, unable to process the words. "I don't understand. They've been seen together constantly. She was in his private box tonight." "I know." Lord Hartley's expression was deeply serious. "Your Grace, what I'm about to tell you is highly confidential. Lady Margaret Sinclair is not the Duke's mistress. She's a spy." Chapter 6. The Intelligence Recruitment. Diana sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unreliable. A spy. An operative for His Majesty's Intelligence Service, to be precise. Lord Hartley moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of brandy without asking permission, pressing one into Diana's trembling hands. She specializes in counter-espionage against Bonapartist agents operating in London. The Duke has been working with the Foreign Office since his grand tour. His travels, his absences, even his coldness, all carefully constructed cover for intelligence work. The brandy burned down Diana's throat, but it steadied her. Her mind raced, reassembling 8 months of pain into an entirely different picture. The parliamentary sessions that kept him in London, the unexplained trips, his refusal to be seen with me. Lady Margaret serves as his liaison on a particularly delicate matter: French financial networks attempting to destabilize British credit. They've been working to identify and neutralize these agents before they can trigger a banking crisis. Hartley sat across from her, his expression grave. The appearances together, the late-night meetings, all legitimate intelligence work that, unfortunately, provided excellent cover by appearing to be an illicit affair. Relief flooded through Diana, so powerful it left her lightheaded. He hadn't replaced her, hadn't preferred another woman. The loneliness was real, but the betrayal, that, at least, had been an illusion. But close on relief's heels came anger, white-hot and unexpected. "He could have trusted me," she said quietly. "He could have told me the truth instead of letting me believe." Her voice caught. "Instead of letting all of London believe he found me so inadequate, he needed a mistress within months of our marriage." "The fewer who know your grace, the safer everyone remains. If you had known the truth and behaved differently toward Lady Margaret or toward the Duke, it might have exposed the operation. Your genuine distress, your dignity in the face of apparent betrayal." Hartley's expression held reluctant admiration. "It only strengthened the deception." Diana set down her glass with deliberate care. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because the Foreign Office has identified a significant new threat. And because, Your Grace, we need you." The world seemed to tilt again, but this time with possibility rather than devastation. Hartley leaned forward. "You've cultivated relationships across every level of society in just a few months. Aristocrats, reformers, military officers, scientists, poets. They all attend your Thursday gatherings. You hear things, see things that others miss. You notice details, remember conversations. Your intelligence and discretion are exactly what we need." "You're recruiting me." Diana's voice held wonder. "Into intelligence work?" "With your permission, yes. We'd like to train you as an operative, utilizing your unique position to gather information and identify potential threats to the Crown." For a long moment, Diana simply stared at him. Then, "Does Edson know you're here?" "He does." Hartley's mouth quirked slightly. "He was resistant, actually. Said you'd married for security, not danger. That dragging you into this world would be unconscionable, given the circumstances of your marriage." Something twisted in Diana's chest. Edson had thought of her safety, had protested her involvement. It wasn't love, perhaps, but it was more concern than she'd known he possessed. "But I convinced him you deserve the choice," Hartley continued. "You're not a child to be protected, Your Grace. You're one of the most capable women I've encountered, and whether the Duke realizes it or not, you've already been an asset. Your work at Meadowhall, your management of resources, your attention to detail, these are precisely the skills we need." Diana stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-swept square. 8 months ago, she had been a terrified bride, crushed by her husband's rejection. She had rebuilt herself through purpose, transforming Meadowhall, conquering London society, creating meaning from pain. But this was different. This was the possibility of being more than decorative, more than perfect, more than endlessly striving to prove her worth to a husband who never looked. This was the chance to serve something larger than her own wounded pride. This was the chance to prove her worth to herself. She turned back to Lord Hartley, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and certain. "Tell me everything." Over the next 2 hours, Hartley outlined what her training would entail. Cryptography basics, simple codes and ciphers used for passing information. Recognition of patterns in French agent behavior. Methods for safely transmitting intelligence without arousing suspicion. How to use her Thursday salons not just for social gathering, but for strategic intelligence collection. "You'll continue exactly as you have been," Hartley explained. "Your Thursday gatherings are perfect. Diverse guests, intellectual discourse, the appearance of innocent social entertainment. But you'll be listening for specific information, noting who associates with whom, watching for signs of French sympathies or suspicious financial activities." Diana realized with growing amazement that she had been preparing for this without knowing it. Her habit of remembering names and details, her genuine interest in people's concerns and activities, her careful cultivation of relationships across social boundaries, even her hours reading Edson's military correspondence had given her knowledge she could now use deliberately. "When do we begin?" she asked. "Immediately. I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon. A social visit. Nothing suspicious. We'll establish protocols for communication." Hartley stood, preparing to leave. "Your Grace, I must emphasize the danger. If you're discovered, the consequences would be severe. Prison, possibly execution. At minimum, complete social ruin." "I understand. You're certain?" Diana thought of the girl she'd been 8 months ago. Desperate for approval, crushed by rejection, seeing herself only through others' eyes. She thought of the woman she'd become, capable, purposeful, strong enough to stand alone. "I'm certain," she said. Hartley bowed. "Then welcome to His Majesty's service, Your Grace." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. The Duke returns to London in 3 days for a critical meeting with the Prime Minister. He doesn't know you've already accepted." Diana's pulse quickened. After 8 months of absence, Edson was returning. And when he arrived, he would find not the wounded bride he'd left behind, but something he had never anticipated, an equal in his secret world. Chapter 7. The partnership forms. Diana waited in Edson's study, a masculine sanctuary of dark wood and leather that she had never before dared enter. Maps covered one wall. Europe, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic trade routes. His desk was precisely organized, correspondence stacked in neat piles, each labeled in his angular hand. She had positioned herself deliberately in the chair facing the desk, not behind it. She would meet him as an equal, not usurp his authority. The door opened. Edson stopped on the threshold, genuine shock flickering across his usually impassive features. In 8 months, Diana had almost forgotten how imposing he was. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair silvered at the temples, though he was only 32. His gray eyes, cold as winter fog, fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Diana," her name in his voice, the first time she'd heard it since their wedding night. "What are you doing here?" "Lord Hartley briefed me," she said calmly. "About everything. Lady Margaret, the intelligence work, the French financial networks. All of it." His jaw tightened. He had no right. He had every right. And I've accepted his offer. I'm now an operative for His Majesty's service. The words hung in the air between them. For the first time since she'd known him, Diana saw genuine emotion crack through Edson's controlled facade. Not the cold assessment of their wedding night, but something else entirely. Alarm. Absolutely not. He strode into the room, bringing the scent of rain and tobacco. "It's too dangerous. You don't understand what you're agreeing to." "I understand perfectly." Diana rose, meeting his gaze without flinching. Steel wrapped in silk, Hartley had called her capabilities. Let Edson see that steel now. "I understand that while you've been playing at espionage in London, I've been transforming your neglected estate. Repairing cottages, opening schools, establishing medical care. I've built influence across London society that you, with all your coldness and distance, could never achieve." "Diana, I speak 4 languages fluently. I've cultivated relationships with poets, scientists, reformers, military officers, and aristocrats. I remember every conversation, every detail, every connection." She took a step toward him. "I've been invisible to you, Your Grace, but I assure you, I see everything." They stared at each other across the mahogany desk. Diana watched awareness dawn in Edson's eyes, watched him truly see her for perhaps the first time. Not the terrified bride he'd married, not the convenient Duchess who'd solved his succession problem, but a woman of formidable capability who had built herself into something extraordinary without his help or approval. "You've changed," he said quietly. "No, you simply never looked at me long enough to see who I was." A muscle worked in his jaw. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well. But we work together. You take no unnecessary risks. You follow protocols exactly. And if I determine a situation is too dangerous, you withdraw. Agreed?" "Agreed." It was the first real conversation of their marriage. The planning sessions began the following evening. Edson cleared maps and correspondence from his desk, and they sat across from each other as he explained the intelligence landscape with military precision. "Napoleon has networks throughout Britain, mostly focused on gathering military intelligence and identifying weaknesses in our financial systems. Recently, we've intercepted communications suggesting a coordinated attack on British credit, spreading false information about bank failures, manipulating currency exchanges, creating panic." "To what end?" Diana asked. "If they can trigger a banking collapse, Britain's ability to finance the war evaporates. Wellington's army loses its funding. The Royal Navy can't maintain blockades. We'd be forced to negotiate from weakness." Diana leaned forward, studying the map he'd marked with suspected French agent locations. "Who's vulnerable to recruitment? They'd need people with access to financial institutions, preferably those in desperate circumstances." "Precisely." Edson looked at her with something that might have been respect. "That's where your social intelligence becomes invaluable. You know who's in debt, who's desperate, who's vulnerable to pressure or bribery." Over the next week, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Diana would arrive at the study each evening after dinner, and they would work through intelligence reports, cross-referencing names against her detailed knowledge of London society. She was surprised by Edson's analytical mind, the way he could connect disparate pieces of information into coherent patterns. He was surprised, she could tell, by how much she contributed. Details about a lord's gambling debts, a banker's mistress with expensive tastes, a merchant's failing business concealed beneath a facade of prosperity. "You really do see everything," Edson murmured one evening, reviewing her notes on attendees at her Thursday gatherings. "I told you I did. I should have listened." It was the closest he'd come to an apology. The breakthrough came late one night in mid-May. They'd been working for hours, poring over financial records, when Diana's eyes finally grew too heavy to focus. She meant to excuse herself, to retire to her chambers, but the chair was comfortable and the fire warm, and she found herself drifting. When she woke, disoriented, the candles had burned low. Edson stood beside her chair, his coat in his hands, clearly debating something. For a moment, just a moment, she saw conflict in his expression. He reached out as though to carry her to bed, then stopped himself, old habits of distance reasserting themselves. Instead, he draped his coat over her shoulders with surprising gentleness. Diana kept her eyes closed, unwilling to break whatever spell had made him capable of this small kindness. She felt him pause, heard his breath catch slightly. Then his footsteps retreated to the desk. She opened her eyes to find him still working by candlelight, his profile stark against the shadows. There was something almost vulnerable in the way he hunched over the papers, his usual rigid posture relaxed in what he thought was solitude. "You should rest," Diana said softly. He didn't startle, though she'd thought him unaware she was awake. "As should you." "I'm comfortable here." "Diana, I know. It's improper for a duchess to sleep in her husband's study." She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, catching the scent of him, sandalwood and something else, uniquely Edson. "But we seem to be beyond propriety now, don't we?" He turned to face her fully, and in the candlelight, his expression was softer than she'd ever seen it. Not warm, perhaps, but no longer cold. "I suppose we are." It was a moment of unexpected intimacy, fragile as frost. Neither of them moved to break it. Finally, Edson returned to his papers. "I've identified our target. Sir Horace Bledsoe. He serves on 3 bank boards, has access to the highest levels of British finance. He's also deeply in debt and desperate to maintain his lifestyle." Diana sat up straighter, all drowsiness forgotten. "I know Bledsoe. He attended my Thursday gathering last week." "Did he?" Edson's expression sharpened with Hunter's focus. "Then, Your Grace, you will be our key to catching him." Chapter 8. The Trap. Sir Horace Bledsoe was everything London society admired: a respected financier, advisor to the Prince Regent, patron of the arts. His wife, Lady Bledsoe, held one of the most coveted positions in society's upper echelons. To the world, they were impeccable. But intelligence suggested Bledsoe was funneling British gold to French agents, selling secrets that cost soldiers' lives. The proof, however, remained elusive. He was careful, methodical, and left no obvious trail. "We need to draw him out," Edson explained during one of their evening planning sessions. "Make him confident enough to be careless." Diana studied the dossier Hartley had compiled. His wife is the key. She manages his social calendar, vets his associations. If I can become her trusted confidant, it could take months. Then we'd better begin immediately. Over the next 6 weeks, Diana executed her strategy with the precision of a military campaign. She attended Lady Bledsoe's musicales and garden parties, always arriving with the perfect gift. Rare tea from China, French novels despite the war, silk fans painted with exquisite detail. She laughed at Sir Horace's tedious anecdotes about banking regulations. She praised his mediocre wine collection with such sincerity that he glowed with pleasure. Most importantly, she became exactly what they expected. A charming, decorative Duchess with more beauty than substance. "My dear Duchess," Lady Bledsoe confided during an afternoon call, "you're such a refreshing change from those dreadfully serious women who think themselves so clever. You understand that a woman's true power lies in grace, not intellect." Diana smiled serenely. "You're too kind, Lady Bledsoe." Behind her perfect smile, she catalogued every detail. The way Sir Horace's hand trembled slightly when certain topics arose, his careful avoidance of questions about his French investments, the coded messages that arrived via servants at odd hours. By mid-June, Lady Bledsoe considered Diana one of her dearest friends. "Perfect," Edson murmured when Diana reported this development. "Now we spring the trap." Diana's midsummer ball became the most anticipated event of the season. 200 guests from every level of society filled the Meadowhall townhouse. Aristocrats, diplomats, military officers, financiers, artists. The music was superb. The champagne flowed freely, and every detail was perfection. Except that nothing was accidental. Diana had orchestrated the seating arrangements with surgical precision. Lady Bledsoe found herself beside the Prussian attaché, Baron von Kessler, who was famous for his loose tongue after sufficient wine. Sir Horace stood near the terrace doors, where a textile merchant named Rousseau had positioned himself as though by chance. Diana circulated through the ballroom, the perfect hostess, while watching everything. As predicted, the Baron's third glass of champagne loosened his discretion. "Dreadful business with the Austrian loan," he said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "The Emperor won't approve the terms. Wellington will be short £40,000 for the Spanish campaign." Diana saw it, the flicker of Lady Bledsoe's eyes toward her husband, Sir Horace's slight nod, his casual drift toward the terrace where Rousseau waited. She adjusted her fan, angling it precisely as Edson had instructed. Across the ballroom, Edson materialized at her side. Now. They slipped through the French doors into the garden, keeping to the shadows of the ancient oak that dominated the terrace. The June night was warm, the air heavy with roses. Voices drifted from just beyond the tree. £40,000 short. Sir Horace's voice, tight with urgency. Wellington's Spanish position becomes untenable without those funds. My employers will be most interested. The accent was subtle, but Diana caught the French inflection beneath the merchant's careful English. And the munitions shipments from Portsmouth? Delayed. The manifests I provided showed incorrect quantities. By the time they discover the error, your fleet will have moved. Diana's blood ran cold. How many British soldiers would die because of this man's treachery? The troop movements from your last communication proved accurate, Rousseau continued. Marshal Soult was able to reposition accordingly. Your intelligence regarding Wellington's weakness at Talavera was worth every shilling you paid, Bledsoe interrupted. Now, about my compensation. Gentlemen. Lord Hartley stepped from the shadows, 6 armed men flanking him. I believe this conversation is concluded. Sir Horace's face went white in the moonlight. His eyes darted desperately, landing on Diana as she and Edson emerged from concealment. You! Venom dripped from his voice. You're just a decorative fool. A pretty face with an empty head. Diana met his gaze with perfect composure. That's precisely what I wanted you to believe, Sir Horace. Edson's hand touched her back briefly, a gesture of solidarity, of partnership. Take them, he said quietly to Hartley's men. As the agents dragged Bledsoe and Rousseau away, the man's protests echoing across the garden, Diana felt the weight of what they'd accomplished. How many lives saved? How many British secrets protected? The remaining guests were ushered away with a carefully constructed cover story about a medical emergency. Within hours, word reached them from the Foreign Office. The intelligence Bledsoe had sold was being systematically corrected. Wellington's campaign would proceed as planned. The munitions would arrive on schedule. Brilliantly executed, Your Grace. Lord Hartley bowed to Diana with genuine respect. The Foreign Office is in your debt. After he departed, Diana found herself alone in the ballroom, surrounded by the debris of the evening, abandoned champagne flutes, crushed rose petals, a discarded fan. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt oddly hollow. She walked through the silent house, her footsteps echoing on marble floors, until she found Edson in the conservatory. He stood before the windows, looking out at the garden where they'd caught a traitor, his posture rigid with intention she couldn't interpret. Edson, she said softly. He turned, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not the cold assessment, not the distant politeness. Something raw and unguarded that disappeared almost immediately, but not before she had glimpsed it. You were magnificent tonight, he said. We were successful. Diana moved closer. But that's not what I came to discuss. She took a breath, gathering her courage. We need to talk, really talk. Not about intelligence, or operations, or the war. About us. Chapter 9. The Confession and Resolution. Night-blooming jasmine filled the conservatory with heavy sweetness. Beyond the glass, London slept, unaware that a traitor had been caught in their midst. Diana waited, watching emotions flicker across Edson's face. Emotions she had never seen him permit himself before. I owe you an explanation, he said finally. Several, actually. You owe me nothing. Our arrangement was clear from the beginning. No. His voice was rough. It wasn't clear. It was cowardly. Diana's breath caught. In 9 months of marriage, she had never heard him admit weakness of any kind. Edson turned back to the windows, as though he could only speak these words to the darkness. My parents' marriage was a war zone. My mother took lovers, publicly, deliberately, each affair designed to humiliate my father. He retaliated with cruelty and violence. I watched it destroy them both, watched affection twist into weaponry, He paused. I was 8 when I decided that love was a weakness I would never permit myself. Duty would be everything. Duty was safe. And I seemed like safe duty, Diana said quietly. You seemed gentle enough not to demand what I believed I couldn't give. I wanted a controllable marriage, an heir, a hostess, someone who wouldn't require anything I couldn't provide. He laughed bitterly. I was spectacularly wrong about everything. What changed? You did. He turned to face her. I watched you transform Meadowhall from abandonment into something beautiful. I read every report of your London triumphs. And He stopped abruptly. You what? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, come with me. He led her through the silent house, upstairs she'd never climbed, to the north tower she'd assumed was closed. He produced a key, opened the door, and gestured her inside. Diana stepped into a room flooded with moonlight from tall windows, and froze. The studio was filled with canvases, dozens of them, stacked against walls, propped on easels, covering every surface. All of her. Diana at her writing desk, lamplight gilding her profile. Diana among the tenant children at Meadowhall, laughing. Diana at her first London ball, radiant and utterly alone. Diana in the gardens at sunset, her expression unbearably sad. Each painting was exquisite, tender, detailed, capturing not just her appearance, but something deeper. The loneliness, the strength, the transformation from wounded girl to formidable woman. Diana touched the nearest canvas with trembling fingers. When did you paint these? I couldn't stop seeing you. Edson's voice was barely above a whisper. Even when I stayed away. Especially then. Every report from Pemberton, every mention of you in society columns. I painted what I imagined, what I remembered, what I desperately wanted to witness. He moved closer. I fell in love with my own wife and convinced myself I had no right to tell you. Diana turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. You could have simply come home. I was afraid you'd already learned not to want me there, that I'd destroyed any chance of, his voice broke, of being more than the man who humiliated you on your wedding night. For a long moment, Diana simply looked at him. This man who had hurt her so deeply, who had left her to rebuild herself alone, who had, apparently, been breaking his own heart in the process. I had learned that, she said finally. You taught me well. I learned to stop hoping you might care, learned to build a life that didn't need you. His face fell, all hope extinguished. But perhaps, Diana continued softly, perhaps we could learn differently. Both of us. She watched understanding dawn in his eyes. Then he was crossing the space between them, his hands framing her face with a gentleness she'd never known he possessed. May I? He whispered. She nodded. Their first real kiss was tender, hesitant, full of possibility. Not the cold duty of their wedding night, but something entirely new. A beginning rather than an ending. When they finally drew apart, Diana rested her forehead against his. We can't erase what happened. The hurt was real. I know. But we could start over, not as strangers bound by contract, but as partners who've earned each other. Will you give me another chance? His voice was raw with vulnerability. Diana smiled through her tears. We'll give each other one. Epilogue. 2 years later, the nursery at Meadowhall was flooded with June sunlight. Baby Thomas, 8 months old, gurgled with laughter as his mother made faces at him from her window seat. Diana had never imagined she could feel this complete. This settled in her own happiness. "Hold still just a moment longer," Edson said from his easel near the door. "The light is perfect." He sketched them openly now, joyfully, no longer hiding his art or his affection. The entire house knew the Duke painted his wife and son obsessively, that he could rarely pass either of them without pausing to simply look, as though still amazed by his good fortune. A knock interrupted them. Henderson entered with Lord Hartley's dispatch. Diana scanned it quickly. "Another assignment. A suspected French agent in the Admiralty." "Will you take it?" Edson asked, setting down his pencil. "If I can arrange adequate cover. Mrs. Pemberton is excellent with Thomas." "You don't need to justify it." Edson moved to her side, dropping a kiss on her hair. "Your work is important, and you're extraordinary at it." She smiled up at him, still sometimes surprised by this version of her husband. Warm, present, real. "I married the most remarkable woman in England," he said, "and I'm finally wise enough to know it." "You married me out of obligation," Diana laughed. "Let's not revise history too dramatically." "True," he conceded, scooping Thomas into his arms. "But I fell in love with you out of inevitability, and that makes all the difference." Through the nursery windows, Meadowhall's gardens bloomed. Roses, lavender, hollyhocks, testament to care and attention and patience. Their marriage had begun in duty and coldness, born of obligation rather than choice. But in the space between that frozen beginning and this warm present, they had built something neither had imagined possible. The Duke had wed her out of obligation and turned away. But in turning back, he had found his match, his equal, his love. Sometimes the coldest beginnings yield the warmest endings.